The Jerusalem Council meeting. A comparison of Galatians 2 and Acts 15. The first point to make here, the reason for this meeting. Paul says in his own words in his letter to the Galatians, he says, I went up because of a revelation and set before them the gospel I proclaim among the Gentiles. Keep in mind, he has up to this point been preaching in the Gentile world for 14 years plus 3 years, 17 years. This is the first time he's had any kind of check or balance on what it is he's preaching, unless we count the brief meeting that was 14 years earlier where he only met Peter and James, but we don't know what they talked about at that time. This is the first time there is a formal meeting or a check or balance. He says, set before them the gospel I preach among the Gentiles in order to make sure I was not running nor had run in vain. If we compare Acts 15, it doesn't say he went to Jerusalem because of a revelation. Acts tells the story this way. Some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers. This would be in Antioch. Some came down from Judea and they were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And then this caused no small dissension and debate. It troubled them, I'm paraphrasing right now, it troubled them so much that they decided to make a trip to Jerusalem to settle this question. I want to skip just briefly all the way down here to the end of Galatians 2. Some scholars have said that the confrontation between Paul and Peter, when he confronted Peter to the face, and this was about Jews and Gentiles eating together, this might have been what sparked the reason for the Jerusalem Council meeting, meaning that this might, Paul may have even been telling something that happened earlier, but that is a question mark. Okay. The way Paul has it in his letter is that he has it after the meeting, but he could have been telling something that happened before the meeting. Let's go back up here to our comparison. In the Jerusalem Council meeting, according to Acts, it says, but some believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, it is necessary to circumcise them and order them to keep the law of Moses. So here you have them, even during the meeting, there's this faction of believers who belong to this group of the Pharisees. So it looks like in Acts that these are the ones who are making all the trouble and saying that Gentiles have to be circumcised, order them to keep the law of Moses. But when we look in Galatians, and let's just go briefly down to that thing where Paul opposes Peter to the face. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James. So Paul, it looks as though Paul is saying, hey, these men came from James. And then that's why Peter withdrew and Barnabas went along and acted hypocritically and didn't want to eat with the Gentiles anymore. It seems as if Paul is saying, yeah, this is from James. But when we look at the Jerusalem Council meeting, I'm skipping around a little bit here, but this is important, okay? When they finish the meeting and they write a letter to Antioch, and wow, I would like to know who wrote that letter. If Jesus' original disciples were mostly illiterate, I don't know, did Paul write that letter? I would really like to know who wrote that letter. Okay, it says, okay, we're sending this letter with our judgment, our decision, to Antioch, okay, with the following letter. The brothers, both the apostles and the elders, to the brothers who are of the Gentiles in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia, greetings. We have heard that some persons have gone out from us and troubled you with words, unsettling your minds, although we gave them no instructions. Interestingly, the King James Version says, we gave them no commandment. The NIV says, without our authorization. James is speaking here and saying, some people went there, they really upset and troubled your mind, saying that these Gentiles have to be circumcised, but we did not tell them to do that. They were going without our command or authorization. They were doing that on their own. The Acts 15, it looks as though this was the group, the faction of Pharisee believers who are these Judaizers who were going and doing this. James is saying this was not from the top. This was not from the leadership. This was not from the majority of us. But when we look at Paul's letter, it seems to be that it was from James. Let's take a look at this James, who just shows up in the book of Acts 15. Before we do that, though, let's take a quick look at what Peter said here. I'm going to skip some of the part in Galatians 2 since that was covered in another video, but I'll just briefly say here, Paul, in his own words, does not seem to have much regard for the leaders in Jerusalem. He says he met Peter and James on a previous meeting, which was only 15 days. But then during this Jerusalem Council meeting, according to Galatians 2, those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. Then he names them by name, when James and Cephas and John, who seem to be pillars. I mean, look at that language. It doesn't seem like he really respects or wants to learn from them. He's just saying, well, whatever, whoever they are, doesn't make any difference to me. Paul has his own gospel, and he believes that is the only gospel. In Acts, it looks as though Peter is going along with Paul. It seems like Peter is a copy of Paul, okay? Peter says in this meeting in Acts is written decades later, so, if it conflicts with Paul's letters, I would probably go with Paul's letters that are written much earlier. Peter says in this meeting, okay, Peter stood up and said, brothers, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe. In Acts, Peter goes to the house of Cornelius, who is a God-fearer, a Gentile, and here in this meeting, Peter is supposedly saying, by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the gospel. Wait a minute, I thought that Paul was the missionary to the Gentiles. Anyways, that's what it says here in Acts. Acts is being consistent with itself, that Peter went to Cornelius. And then he says, having sprinkled or having cleansed their hearts by faith. Yeah, Peter and this whole Pauline gospel of faith. Acts is just sort of mixing this all together in here. He says, put a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear. He's talking about the law. Peter, are you saying that neither you nor your fathers have been able to bear that yoke of the law? Wow. that does not seem to be what happened historically or what Peter would have really said, but this is the story in Acts. As a side note here, Peter is saying that he was the one who, by my mouth, the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel. That looks to conflict with Galatians 2. If you take a look over Galatians 2, Paul is saying one of the conclusions of the meeting was when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, that would be the Jews, verse 7, now verse 8, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. Paul is saying quite clearly here, like as if this was what they decided in the meeting, I should go to the Gentiles and Peter should go to the circumcised. After they had finished speaking, James replied, "Brothers," who is this James and where did he come from? I mean, we don't hear anything about James through the four Gospels and then all the way through Acts until we get to Acts chapter 15. Who is this person who appears out of nowhere as the head of the Jerusalem church? There are a few references, yes, to Jesus's brothers. Jesus' brothers are listed. There are four brothers listed as Simeon, Levi, Judas, and I can't remember all four names, but anyways, they list four names, and Paul testifies that he had met Peter and James, the brother of the Lord, specifically James, the brother of the Lord. It is my contention that this is James, the brother of the Lord, who becomes the head of the Jerusalem church, but he is marginalized in the Gospels and in Acts. He's only mentioned in Acts just a couple of times. Paul's letters may even mention him a few more times than what's actually mentioned in Acts. So I thought Peter was the head of the church, but after Peter went to the house of Cornelius, and maybe he was going to foreign areas, somehow or other James had become the head of the church. James says here in verse 19, "Therefore it is my judgment that we should not trouble those Gentiles who turn to God. We should write to them and just tell them to abstain from a few things." He lists 4 things, and these are very much like the Noahide laws. Noahide laws would apply to all people for all time, Jews and Gentiles. Okay? And what are those things? To abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from what has been strangled, and from blood. And there is a whole nother study on that, how those Noahide laws continue all the way through. And even in the book of Revelation, those come up again. Just as a side note, in Paul's letters, he seems to not follow this. He seems to say, eat whatever's put before you. Doesn't matter what you eat. So, but this is what James's judgment is, that the Gentile believers don't need to be circumcised or follow the law of Moses, but they do need to keep some basic Noahide laws. And then